Well, thank you, Alexis, as always, for organizing and running our webinar series. And as Alexis mentioned, it's great to see and have so many of you online with us again this morning or afternoon from wherever you are. And I'm in Argentina because the Institute of the Americas is hosting a roundtable here tomorrow in Buenos Aires to talk about what's going on in Argentina, particularly with unconventional resources and the famous Vaca Muerta shale play, and the fact that YPF is making some progress in that development. So we're excited about that discussion. But today we're also very excited because we're going to be talking about the electric sector in Mexico. And for those of you who know the Institute, pardon me for boring you, but for those who don't, the Institute of the Americas is about 30 years old, and for about 25 of those years, the energy program has been very involved with Mexico. And so everyone realizes how much change has occurred in Mexico over those 25 years, and especially in the last couple of years. We spent a good deal of time in the last several months having discussions on the reform as it pertains to the upstream and the hydrocarbon sector. We've gotten a little bit into renewables, but we're really happy because today we're going to focus attention and we think some deserved attention on the power sector, electric sector. There's so many pieces to Mexico's energy reform, and obviously Pemex and the upstream and the big ticket oil and gas investments have gotten all kinds of attention, rightfully so, but we think it merits even more attention right now on the power sector. And primarily that's because as our presenters, and we want to thank Pillsbury and John McNeese and Michael Hindis for sharing their expertise with us. And the impetus here is that about 3 weeks ago, as many of you know, the Mexican government unveiled the draft market guidelines, or I guess what they're called in Spanish, the bases del mercado, that are part of the plan spelled out in the energy reform as it pertains to the electric sector, and specifically the efforts and measures to set up the wholesale electricity market. Obviously, that's the name of our webinar today. And depending on who you talk to, I think that the role of the wholesale electricity market can probably be seen or described as the architecture for the entire overhaul of Mexico's electric sector and the reform vis-a-vis the electric sector. All of the rules, and there's the document is massive, and I look forward to seeing how John and Michael have able to distill such a massive document with so many questions surrounding the market participant rules, the long-term planning, the coordination between gas and power, the clean energy certificate. I think I have just as many questions going into this presentation today as many of you online. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just turn it over to our friends at Pillsbury, Michael Hindis and John McNeese, to launch into this presentation. And we really look forward to it this year. I think the target is that the wholesale electricity market will be finalized in operation by the end of this year. So obviously these next several months are critical in this development process. So John, thanks so much. We've known John for a long time. He's been looking at energy in Mexico probably as long as the Institute has. So it's a pleasure to have him, and great to meet Michael today. John and Michael, over to you. Thanks so much.
Very good. Well, thanks to the Institute of the Americas for sponsoring the series of webinars. They're very helpful. I've listened in on many and hope to do as good a job as your previous speakers. We're going to start with an introduction to the process that's underway, and then Michael will be focusing on some of the detailed substantive issues, and then I will close out with commentary on the Certificados de Energías Limpias, or CELs, which is the equivalent of RECs. Our first slide speaks to the comment or the point that the Mexican Ministry of Energy, which we call SENER, sent the draft Bases del Mercado Eléctrico, which we will call the Bases, Guidelines for the Electricity Market, to the Federal Commission for Regulatory Improvement, called COFEMER for the initials in Spanish, on February 24, 2015. This is the first step of putting together the wholesale electricity market, and it is critical because it shows the Ministry of Energy's thinking on what this market's going to look like. The bases establish the principles for the design and operation of the wholesale electricity market as defined in the law of the electrical industry. And including the auctions contemplated by the law. So this is the big picture document. This is the overall principles for design and operation. Now, under the Federal Administrative Procedures Law, as a general matter, regulations are sent to COFMR for determination if the benefits of the regulation outweigh the costs. But as a matter of Article 95 of the Law of the Electrical Industry, the bosses are exempt. They did not have to go through this procedure. So why did they submit it? Well, there are benefits to the review. When you make a submission to COFMR, you have to do a regulatory impact report called a MIR, M-I-R in Spanish, which makes the argument for why the benefits of the regulation outweigh the cost. And there is also a public comment proceeding. Next slide, Alexis. And very interestingly, the bosses submitted by SENER focus on cost benefits. Key point is that it's proposing or contemplating a 26 to 48% reduction in tariffs, which is huge, obviously, and this is based in part on the experience of Chile. During the period 1997, after the liberalization of that market, both residential and industrial tariffs were down about 48%. And then for Argentina, between 92 and 97, residential tariffs down 26% and industrial tariffs down 16%. This is going to be a very significant point, both because President Peña Nieto sold the energy reform based on lower energy prices, power prices. As a general matter, on average, Mexican tariffs are now about 23–25% higher than on average U.S. tariffs, and they'd be like 75% higher, but for various subsidies involved. So getting these tariffs on average down 26 to 48% is consistent with and carries out President Peña Nieto's commitment when the energy reform on the electric side was presented to the Mexican public. So this is part of the Peña Nieto's administration's argument, continuing argument for the energy reform. Key focus, reducing prices. Another benefit of going before COFMR was the easy process of public comment. If you go to the COFMR website, you are invited on the front page of the website to make a public comment. It's a very simple comment process. You simply identify the number of the proceeding, which you can get by going through the COFMR website and searching for the bosses, and then simply putting your comment in. We contemplate that many interested parties will submit. For example, at the time that the guidelines for the clean energy certificates were coming out, the Trade Association for the Solar Industry made very substantial comments. We expect that Trade Association and others to make comments on this. The renewable energy business in particular does have concerns about the bosses that came out and will be submitting comments, I'm sure. After the COFMR review and dictamen, which is their formal judgment that the benefits outweigh the burdens, then SENER will issue final bosses, which will certainly have changes from the draft. And those bosses will then go into effect upon notification to the participants in the market. Next slide, please. Remembering that the bases are a statement of principles for creation and operation of the market, once adopted and presented to the public, they must be elaborated into three different components of the overall market rules: market practice manuals, operational guidelines, and criteria and procedures of operation. And collectively, these are called the market operational provisions, disposiciones under the law. And this is the more technical side. So going through these, the Market Practices Manual states the principles for calculation, instruction, rules, directives, examples, and procedures for administration, operation, and planning. So this is not the details of process, although it may get into some detail, but it's focused on principles. And there will be a detailed market practices manual for each of the 10 chapters of the bases. We will identify those bases a bit later. Those chapters, we will not go into detail, obviously, because of the short time period. Down the hierarchy, the operational guidelines establish formulas and procedures that, due to complexity and specificity, are contained in documents different from Market Practices Manual. Now, as a general principle, as you look at these three items, let's focus on the operational guidelines. The operational guidelines are lower in the hierarchy of components. They have to follow the Market Practices Manual, which in turn have to follow the basis. Okay, so at this level of the hierarchy, we're dealing with formulas and procedures that, if highly complex or highly specific, are contained in documents different from the Market Practices Manual. We're not going to go into this right now, but there are different procedures for amending and commenting and seeking changes on these elements of the market operational provisions. And at the lowest level of the market operational provisions are criteria and procedures of operation, and those are specifications, technical notes, and operating criteria required for implementation of the constituent elements of the market rules above in the design of software or daily operations. So this is going to get into the nitty-gritty of how this really works in practice. Next slide, please. Okay, to give you a sense of how all of this will play out, the bases alone are nearly 200 pages. Remember, this is just a statement of principles for creation and operations of the market. But even with those 200 pages, it's in some respects a highly annotated table of contents. So the details will be filled in by the market operational provisions, which, recall, are those three components that I stated in the last slide. Okay? Now, the bases, which, as noted previously, are the guidelines for the electricity market, and the market operational provisions, the three components, starting with the market operations manuals from the previous page, together that constitutes the market rules. The market rules are the equivalent to the tariffs issued by the U.S. ISOs and RTOs. Okay, next slide. As I've noted, this is the market rules are going to be very like the tariffs from U.S. independent system operators or regional transmission operators. And these particular bases, as a statement of principles, they draw heavily from the California Independent System Operation Tariff, from the PJM rules. That's a balancing authority system operator on the East Coast, including Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and parts of a lot of states, and then the New York Independent System Authority. Just to give you a sense of what's covered in these 200 pages, I'm only touching on the names of the chapters. You can see it on your slideshow there, the contents of the basis and stages of implementation. So that's the summary section, general terms, definitions, overall terms going down to conflict resolution, system reliability, big emphasis on that. And by the way, the CRE is charged with that, the Directorate of Electricity and Renewables. That's a main focus right now. Small systems, market operations, operative planning, long-term markets, monitoring, credit, and billing and collections. These are things that you'd see in any tariff for an independent system operator. Okay, now the bases are for the wholesale market only. CRE still sets retail tariffs, and that's going to be the basic service served by CFE, which is the only permitted supplier of basic services so far. Now here's an interesting issue. Nothing in the bases address potential disconnects between the wholesale market and retail rate design. The retail rate design is not covered in these bases at all. By the way, transmission planning and distribution planning are not covered either. There was some commentary in an earlier draft on transmission and distribution planning, but not in this draft that was submitted to COFEMER. Okay, we're going to comment on general characteristics of the market established by these bases, or outlined by this basis, and then focus on what is unique about Mexico. Three specific areas of comment will be who are the market participants and their obligations, staged implementation of the market, and then clean energy certificates known as CELs. And I'm going to turn the microphone over to Michael. Next slide, please.
Thank you, John. So, as John mentioned, if you're familiar with how some of the United States ISO markets work, you'll find a lot of similarities here, with some exceptions that are peculiar to Mexico and to the law of the electricity industry. So basically, initially on a daily basis, SENERThe will receive offers to purchase and sell energy. The purchase will be from load-serving entities, including qualified users. The offers to sell will be from generators and suppliers. And at that point, through an algorithm, they'll determine the economic dispatch in which injections, that is, a generation, put into the market and withdrawals, which is the load, at each node will be balanced. And the SENERThe will determine the locational marginal prices at each node, which will consist of three components: an energy component, a congestion component, and a loss component. And again, this is very similar to the PJM system, and there's a reason for it, because the architect of the PJM system, Professor William Hogan, has the ear of SENER in designing the market. There will also be ancillary services. Initially, 3 ancillary services will be competitively supplied. These will be regulating reserves, spinning reserves, and operating reserves, while others will initially be regulated by the CRE, and this will be reactive power, reactive reserves, and black start capability. An interesting feature of the bases, which we'll need to follow in great detail, because right now it's just fairly abstract, is the question of gas-electric coordination. And the point here is to make sure that gas supply and gas transport can be scheduled in coordination with energy offers. And this is a subject for the market monitor. And this is an example of where Mexico has really benefited from the experience of 20 years of operating these markets in other parts of North America. As you probably know, in order to make good on President Nieto's promise that electricity rates will be reduced as a result of the reforms, Mexico needs to create and build out a giant addition of gas-fired generation, which would be the lowest cost generation to replace the inefficient, expensive parts of CFE's fleet. And this is also going to require a tremendous expansion of the natural gas supply and pipeline system, which the director of CFE once said is neither national nor a system. And gas-electric coordination has been a problem in the Northeast United States, where the pipeline infrastructure is not sufficient to support the electricity market. So Mexico has kind of jumped ahead of the queue here and anticipates that this could be an issue in achieving the goals of the market. And therefore, they've put a specific placeholder for dealing with gas-electric coordination. Next slide, please. So the next thing we want to focus on is what are the obligations of the market participants and who are the market participants? So there are 5 types of market participants. Most obviously, generators will be market participants, and these will be entities that represent electric plants that will sell into the market. And as is typical in such markets, the physical and operating characteristics of these plants must be registered with SENACE so that SENACE is aware of both their economics and their things like ramp rate, outage rates, and all the rest of that when they dispatch. Then there's something called intermediation generators, and these are generators who represent electric plants and load points included in legacy interconnection contracts in the market. There's a transition here, and there already have been existing self-supply and self-supply consortium and captive power plants in the market who want to enjoy the privileges that they have with the legacy interconnection contracts. And there are a number of initiatives to try to incent people off these legacy contracts and into the market. Suppliers will be marketers with a permit to provide electric supply to the suppliers of basic services, which is right now CFE only, supplier of qualified services, and suppliers of last resort. And then there are non-supplier marketers, and these are people who will be trading without physical assets. And finally, qualified user market participants, which we'll talk about in the next slide. All of the market participants will be bound to the market rules through a market participation contract, which has not yet been published. That contract will be with SENACE, the independent system operator. And again, as is typical in such markets, there will be very strict credit requirements, which will cover trading activity. And the whole idea here, of course, is that SENACE will not take a position in the market itself, so it needs to make sure that the participants who trade through the market are creditworthy, so that no entity is holding the bag. Next slide, please. So the market participants, as I said, are going to be bound to the market rules, and they are at risk for losing their market privileges if the rules are violated. And not only would they lose their privileges, but also there's the potential for disgorgement of all profits. And they could also lose their market privileges if the credit requirements are not met. There are special rules for distributed generation, and I should point out that the term distributed generation in the Mexican market is very different from the way it's used, for example, in the United States. Distributed generation are generators that feed into circuits with a high concentration of load centers, and therefore the generation must be less than the expected demand of the load centers on the distribution circuit, or it must reduce the peak net loading of the circuit. In other words, Mexico sees distributed generation as a way to relieve what would otherwise be congestion. And as John mentioned, neither SENACE nor CRE will intervene in disputes between market participants. And although transmission and distribution providers are not market participants, they'll still be subject to the direction of SENERThe. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So qualified users, they're an interesting case because I think there's going to be a lot of interest in the market of people becoming or supplying to qualified users. And they are users of electricity with a demand at a single load point of at least 3 megawatts in the first year after the adoption of the law, dropping to 2 megawatts the next year and 1 megawatt the year after. And SENERThe has the authority, both under the law and under the BASIs, to decrease that level further. And in the clarification that we saw for the first time in the BASIs, loads of a single economic interest may be aggregated. So I think that we can interpret that as, let's say, different loads with the same owner, for example. Now, if you want to be a qualified user, you don't have to register as a qualified user unless you have never previously been the receipt of the public service of electricity. And this applies to people in self-supply consortium, for example, who never received service from CFE. They have to register in order to trade into the market. Now, a qualified user can also elect to be a market participant if it wants to acquire energy, capacity, ancillary services, or CELs for its own account through the wholesale electric market. Or it may choose to be represented by a supplier of qualified services. Qualified users can enter into long-term contracts with a supplier of qualified services, but will need backup from a supplier of last resort. Next slide, please. The components of the wholesale electricity market are listed in this slide. There'll be a day-ahead market and a real-time market for energy and ancillary services. As we will talk about in a minute, eventually there'll also be an hour-ahead market. There'll be a capacity market, a market for clean energy certificates, auctions for the medium term for energy, and auctions for the long term for capacity, clean energy, and clean energy certificates. There'll also be auctions for financial transmission rights. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Mexico has taken advantage of all the lessons learned in North America and internationally over the last 20 years since ISOs were first created and the wholesale market was first liberalized worldwide. And what Mexico has decided to do, they're caught between wanting this market to start as early as possible after the passage of the energy reform, but also wanting to avoid the mistakes of some of the other ISOs. So new in the BASIs was a determination to implement the energy and ancillary service market in 2 phases. In phase 1, there will be a day-ahead market in which participants will submit binding schedules. And then there'll also be a real-time market. And the real-time market is frankly used, although the BASIs provide that you can get into the real-time market. Mostly the real-time market is used for after-the-fact settlement to adjust imbalances between the day-ahead schedules and the actual performance in the market. The initial market will also have import and export transactions, but there'll be no demand bidding or no virtual bidding. Now, the energy and ancillary services markets will begin testing in September of 2015, and the operation of the phase 1 market will be for schedules that could be submitted December 31st, 2015, for the day-ahead market to open the next day, January 1st, 2016. Next slide, please. Now, in phase 2, there'll be some major additions. The most important of which will be there'll be an hour-ahead market which can be scheduled at it. There'll also be demand bidding by controllable resources. And we'll also add virtual bidding subject to the respective validation of such offers on the part of the market surveillance unit. Now, virtual bidding is kind of an interesting subject and a very controversial one. So it's a little surprising to see it here fully fleshed out in the BOSIs. Virtual bidding does not require physical delivery, and the trader's profits or losses come from settlement of the difference between the day-ahead and real-time price. And the virtue of virtual bidding is that it's supposed to keep the actual bidding more honest, because bidders will not be able to game the system. The real bidders will not be able to game the system because the virtual bidders will actually reap the profits. So it's, again, as I said, it's supposed to smooth the market but keep the bidders more honest. But there's been much concern about market manipulation of congestion due to virtual bidding. And if you want to see how that plays out, I would refer you to the enforcement action against Louis Dreyfus Energy Services, the citation in the slide. And interestingly, William Hogan, who, as I mentioned, is a very influential consultant to SENER and has probably included virtual bidding, has at the same time written analysis of how easy it is to do market manipulation through virtual bidding. So it'll be very interesting to see how the market surveillance unit deals with virtual bidding when in phase 2. And both the testing and operations for this part of the phase 2 market will be in 2018. Next slide, please. So here's the schedule for other components of the wholesale market. The capacity market will be tested in phase 1 in October 15, operations the next month, phase 2 the next year. Financial transmission rights in phase 1. The testing will begin in October 2015 and operations the next month, but only for a maturity of 1, 3, and 10 years. In phase 2 in January, there'll be monthly terms for the financial transmission rights auction. And then the remaining components of the wholesale market will be instituted in one phase. Long-term auctions for capacity, clean energy, and CELs for 10-year contracts will be tested in 2015 September and operating the next month, October 2015. And again, as John will explain in a minute, this will be for contracts beginning in 2018. So that facilities can be constructed after the award of the CELs has been made. Then there'll be a medium-term auction of energy with testing in 2016 and operations in October 2016. And then the market for CELs will be tested and operated 2018 for periods set by the CRE. And now we can go to the next slide, and now for a detailed discussion of the CELs, I'm going to turn it over back to John.
Thank you, Michael. The CELs are going to be the primary mechanism for encouraging clean energy. And key issue here is this is not just renewables. We think of clean energy in the U.S. as solar, wind, geothermal primarily. There's a few others. But in Mexico, it will include large and small hydropower, nuclear, and the large hydropower and nuclear generally under the auspices, or are under the auspices of the state, and also efficient cogeneration. We say it's the primary mechanism because currently it is possible to sell clean energy strictly on an economic basis. That is because people are able to set self-supply contracts against applicable tariffs to be lower than applicable tariffs, and it's a good deal both for the generator and for the recipient. The key point there is that there are variable tariffs across different types of use in Mexico. High rate tariffs include commercial, big box stores, and state and local governments. So it has been possible for sellers of wind energy, and in particular, and hydropower, to sell to self-supply consortia at lower than the applicable tariff prices, and be quite successful at that. Now, if Mexico succeeds in reducing tariffs 26 to 48% on average, that's going to affect the economic strategy significantly. And so it becomes a focus on the CELs, which we can think of as equivalent to RECs in the U.S. Michael and I worked on a deal recently where the price of power was very low, but the price of the RECs in the deal were very high because the utility in question needed the RECs. And that kind of deal is fundamentally what the Mexican government contemplates here. Not that the energy prices have to be that low, but the RECs, or the CELs in this case, will drive the economics. SENER has issued the first requirements for CELs, load-serving entities, which includes not only the utilities themselves, like CFE, but self-supply qualified users who go out to buy in the marketplace. They will have to have CELs as well, and anyone else, for example, who's got a legacy interconnection agreement supplying their own power, they have to have either clean energy they are generating themselves or acquire supplies in the form of CELs. So the first requirement for CELs is going to be 8.2% of delivered energy for 2008. There was controversy upon whether requirement for CELs should start earlier, but SENER made it clear they felt that to get the process up and running, getting the facilities up and running, and have a market infrastructure to make this work, it would be important to delay the requirements until 2018. Now, the first auction for CELs to be used beginning 2018 are scheduled to begin this fall through CENACE. And you'll recall from Michael's comments that the long-term auctions for the long-term for clean energy and CELs will be this year. The long-term contracts are important, and in my discussions with the government of Mexico, they're very focused on these auctions. The auctions will only apply to CFE, which is the provider of basic service, but CFE is going to be required to buy CELs through this auction mechanism, and they're going to be 10-year contracts. And the government is hoping that the auction is going to set a market price for CELs, which will then allow people to enter into a bilateral contract at prices that they're comfortable with. Remember, I was saying before that prior deals under the self-supply regime, self-supply consortia, they were pricing against the applicable tariff. Well, once you get into a wide open market situation, people are going to be very leery about signing long-term contracts until they have a sense of pricing. And that's why this auction becomes so important, is for CFE, in effect, to be setting a price for CELs to meet its own requirements. A 10-year period for these CEL contracts may be too short for long-term financing, but we'll just have to see. That's what the government decided on, and that's what we're going to try to finance against. Now, as Michael mentioned before, there will be the opportunity to bid into a market to sell cells, and that bid can be made, and the bid and the award made before the facilities are actually made, actually constructed. The theory being that once you have the contract for the cells, that will be available to support financing for building the clean energy facility. Per the CEL guidelines, and there are a set of guidelines that were issued back in October 31, SENER cannot lower the percentage requirement in subsequent years. So they will set requirements 3 years out, and when they set them again, they cannot reduce that. The goal is 33% by 2024, but only if economically feasible. But it has been left to SENER on how they're going to ramp up to that. So the starting point is 8.2% of clean energy by 2018. That's the first step on what we expect to be a ratchet up. This baseline of 8.2% and the ability to contract bilaterally may allay concerns about the ability to finance clean and renewable projects, which rely in part on the income stream from CELs. In my view, this is still up in the air. No one is quite sure yet how this is going to work. We're not quite sure how the auctions for CFE scheduled to occur later this year will work and what kind of prices they'll set, and whether that will set a market price for bilateral contracts. And all of those things must come together. The renewables energy is skeptical so far of these bosses. There's still a sense in certain quarters that there really needs to be procurement decisions, i.e. set-asides for different types of clean energy, but SENER has resisted that so far, both in the law and the regulations and the CEL guidelines. So we will just have to see. With that, it completes our presentation, and we're open to questions, and I'm assuming that Alexis will act as the coordinator on those questions. So, Alexis, back to you.
Okay, is that Jeremy? There we go. Hi, actually, Jeremy is going to be taking over this. Jeremy, you online?
Yes. Unfortunately, you'll have to listen to me, but Alexis, thank you. Alexis is trying to make sure she's attending to everyone's requests and needs here on the back page. So thank you, John and Michael, for a very interesting, obviously there's so much information, but wonderfully distilled. Thank you. Quick reminder, folks, we would like you to pose questions under the question mark function, which is, if you look on your right-hand side of the screen, there's a little icon that's sort of a person with a question mark. Please post your questions there. That's where we will get them and put them up on the screen for our presenters to respond to. We do have a lot of questions, and we want to get to them. Somebody had emailed me a question, and so let me go ahead and put that up right away, since that was the first one I received. And I think it's a good place to start. Hopefully you can read this, John and Michael. It's a bit small, but hopefully you can read it. I can't expand the question. Can you guys read that okay?
First of all, yes. Jeremy, one thing, you're a little bit over-modulated, so there's a huge amount of static every time you talk. If you talked a little bit softer, I think we'd understand you better, okay?
Let me dial my microphone back. Okay, can you hear me better now?
Way better, thank you.
All right. Okay, great. I've put up on the screen the first question, and it gets to the definition and wants to get into qualified user. And let me read it because it is small. Under the new legislation and reforms, if a generator has a PPA with a qualified user, e.g. a municipality, and the facility produces more power than the municipality can use, is CFE authorized to write an agreement to purchase the excess power? If so, is there a limit to how much excess power can be produced? John, you want to take that, or Michael?
Do you want me to take it?
I'll go ahead and take it. This is a little complicated because this depends on whether you've got a legacy interconnection agreement or you're under the new rules. As I said before, because of the different tariffs for different kinds of customers, there were certain users who were inclined to enter into self-supply consortia, and municipalities were one of them. Municipalities, particularly for street lighting, have a very high tariff. So they have entered into self-supply consortia and then PPAs within that. And that being the case, a municipality will continue to be a qualified user after the fact, because users under legacy interconnection agreements continue to be or will be deemed qualified users. Now, as I say, this gets a little complicated because under the legacy interconnection agreements, there are provisions in there where CFE is the backup and provides power to solve the intermittency problem and also buys the excess. So those legacy interconnection contracts will stay in place. Now, and so CFE will continue to acquire power under those legacy interconnection agreements. Once we get into the current regime, which is contracts entered into on or after August 12, which was the effective date of the law of the electrical industry, a municipality would have to elect to be a qualified user. And this is tricky again because many municipalities have load centers for each light. On one deal we're working on, there's like 5,000 load centers. But because of this aggregation principle that Michael mentioned, they could be a qualified user. So then the question is, how do they deal with the market for the excess? And that is clearly permitted under the bases. So they would have to have a supplier be dealing with them, either an intermediation generator or a supplier to sell the excess, and CFE could act in that role and could also be a buyer. Now, on the question of a limit to how much excess power would be bought, I don't know the answer to that. When you get a generation permit, which you're going to have for any deal put in place post August 12th, the CRE will issue a generation permit. And it's going to be a much more simplified process than was the case before. But one of the things about that permit is it's going to state how much generation you can do. And so there will also be concurrently a major overall process of generation planning. And that's not clear how it's going to work, but I'm guessing that people will not be able to put in any number they want in that generation permit. There will probably be some cross-checking to see whether there would be a buyer for the rest or how they propose to do it.
Okay.
So the short answer is I don't know. But
yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I think, you know, in an effort, thank you. I know it's complex and there's so many wrinkles, but let's, in an effort to try and get to a couple of other questions, why don't we jump ahead here? And in fact, sticking with the question or a question about qualified users, there's a question that, if I can get it on the screen here, there's a question about threshold. So, there we go. Nope. All right. Let me try and get this up on the screen. There we go. It talks about the threshold for qualified users at 3 megawatts, but should it not be based on megawatt hours? What does the 3 megawatt mean? Could you quickly go through that? And then I want to get into a question that's a very specific question about load pricing, so we can keep moving through some of these questions. And thanks, everyone. I know there's a million questions coming in, and we'll do our best to get to them. So, John, Michael, over to you.
Okay, so 3 megawatts refers to the maximum demand in capacity that you would have on the system. Remember that electricity is composed of both capacity, which is demand, and energy, which is the megawatt hours. So if you're using if your maximum demand over the course of a year is 3 megawatts, that's the threshold, and that's the way load is usually referred to in terms of demand.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Why don't we? There's a very specific question that I think is something that, John, you started to address about pricing. I mean, there's a lot of questions about CELs. I'm going to try and keep those, and we'll get into a bunch of those. But let me jump into a couple of these very specific questions first. There's a question about load. It's very specific here. It says load prices at nodes or aggregate load zones. Do you have any insights on that, John or Michael?
Well, I think that's probably going to be spelled out further when the detailed market rules are published. But right now, it looks like load prices at or it looks like prices at nodes for determining the dispatch model.
Okay. Okay. One more question of a more general nature, and then I'll get into all these questions folks are posing about the clean energy certificates and the CELs. And this is, you all talked about the use of the PJM system operator as a basis and how the Mexican model drew largely on it. So could you talk a little bit more about the capacity market specifically, and is that referencing the PJM model?
Well, I can't talk about it very specifically because this really gets involved in the weeds that we haven't seen yet. But okay. The only capacity market really that they're drawing on is PJM, and I would say that the PJM capacity market hasn't worked tremendously well. There's been a lot of controversy about the results and a lot of issues also in New England about withholding capacity in order to drive up prices for new capacity. So I think we'd have to wait and see how, see the detailed tariff rules to see how this is going to develop.
Something that ties in with that is there's also
go ahead.
There's also contemplated in the process scarcity pricing with gradual changes in prices to deal with scarcity, and that is going to interplay with the capacity market, which is a very advanced concept, as Michael was saying there. They're really jumping from very early in the process to the most cutting edge stuff. So we just have to see how they plan to make it work.
Well, I guess that's what the point is this year, to spend the whole...
Yeah. I hope they have Professor Hogan on speed dial. I said I hope they have Professor Hogan on speed dial.
I'm sure they do. I heard him once referred to as the Michael Jordan of electric markets. So He's a pretty tall chap too, so I guess that makes sense. Let's get into the clean energy certificates and try and I'll do my best to put a lot of these questions up. I think I want to start with one that is very interesting. It's something, John, you alluded to. You were talking about sort of what we call clean energy, what clean energy may mean here, and specifically the question comes down to the allowance or possibility of fossil fuel generated power to be considered clean. Could you talk a little bit more about this definition of clean energy, what qualifies for the CELs? This question refers to efficient cogeneration, but maybe take a second before we get into some of the other questions to talk about that definition and what qualifies.
Well, in the law of the electrical industry, it talks about the possibility of a CEL being over some level of efficiency, and there's been great concern in the industry that extremely efficient, even combined cycle, could be used for CELs. In our discussions with the government officials that we know, they have said they do not expect fossil fuel to be available for CELs except in the case of efficient cogeneration. So am I positive? No, because specific rules on that are not out yet. But do I think that they will be excluded based on what I know about government thinking? Yes. And the efficient cogeneration will generate CELs only above a specific level of efficiency. So that's where we are right now. We do not know specifically what that level will be, but it will not be all the power that comes out of a cogeneration unit.
Thank you, and that's the perfect setup for the next question, which gets more into the emissions side of the CELs. Will the CEL specify that they include or do not include the CO2 emissions reductions produced by a given project or generator? Any thoughts on that as a follow-on?
I'd say at this point the answer is no.
Right. It's only based on megawatt hours. It's only based on megawatt hours produced, or megawatts, and does not involve CO2 emissions.
Now, I should point out, in reference to something John said earlier, we're aware that the trade, this would get into the issue of whether or not the SENER or the Mexican government is going to favor certain types of renewable technologies that would have no emissions. And the answer is, again, consistently, right now, with the market orientation of SENER, the answer is no. If the trade associations or Senator Pacina or someone else eventually gets across some sort of set aside for renewable technologies, this may be an avenue that they would consider. But the plain answer to the question right now is no.
Okay, thank you. And we've got time for a couple more questions. I do want to do one more here on this question of clean energy certificates and CELs. This gets into something I think you were talking about, legacy projects. So here is the question: will existing clean energy generators, e.g. IPP wind schemes or CFE-owned generation, be eligible to receive CELs?
John, you want to take that?
Yeah. Actually, what's going to happen is that those facilities in place before August 12 will have a lesser ability to generate CELs. And so how that's going to work in practice and in detail is not clear yet. Among other things, the new clean energy plants that enter into operation after August 11 will have the right to receive CELs for a period of 20 years. Now, the legacy clean energy facilities that entered into operation before August 11 will have a right to 20 years only for augmentation of production after that date. So the CELs will be very limited for pre-August 12 clean energy facilities.
Okay. You alluded a little bit there to some of the timing. Let's actually, I want to throw up a question, the second to last question, and moving a little bit away from the CELs to more of the timeline and market operations, specifically market participants. And this question has to do with what are the target dates to have market participants sign contracts and get their systems connected. Any thoughts on, and maybe you could even take a second to talk more broadly about the implementation timeline, a commentary timeline, and any thoughts you have about the details on those points.
Well, I think the answer is we don't, we're not aware of the target dates yet, except, as I mentioned, the most important thing is going to be the contract with the market participant, and that has not been published yet. But market participants will have to have those contracts in place before they can participate in the market. In terms of having systems connected, you know, I would say initially, since we're talking about a market that's going to operate in you know, scant 9 months from now, I'm assuming that the initial participants in the market will be existing generators who already have interconnections and want to participate in the market. Obviously, either to roll off their self-supply contracts or to sell excess. In terms of interconnection, we saw an earlier draft of the BOSIs that had very detailed information on interconnection, and as you know, we followed the comments of CFE and SENER. The existing interconnection process is lengthy and very cumbersome, and one of the goals in the energy reform was to simplify it. And strangely, and for reasons we're not aware of, interconnection was taken out of the POSIs that were published. So we are not sure what, if any, expedited interconnection process will be in place before the market starts.
Now, as to interconnection, SENACE did issue some guidelines on interconnection. And so while things are not in the BOSIs, there's a separate document that is quite important. And by the way, that's had a lot of commentary from renewable energy trade associations.
John, thank you. Somebody emailed me a question, and I said I was going to ask one more, but I'll break my own rule and ask two. Somebody emailed me and wanted they said they were unclear your comments about the solar lobby vis-a-vis CELs, and you just started to hint at that. Could you take a 30 seconds to just clarify the comments about that?
The Solar Trade Association has a number of very important companies in it, and there is concern that, at least to date, solar has been more expensive than wind. And so the solar industry is concerned that if they do not have some kind of a set-aside, they would not be able to compete because the CELs are going to be priced, obviously, to some extent on costs. So I think there is a sense on the part of the trade association that there should be, for purposes of multiple sources of clean energy, some set aside for solar. Now, a related topic, geothermal has historically been considerably more expensive than other sources of clean energy. However, it has the benefit of providing baseload power that is steady, power to deal with steady needs, the base load. And so if you're dealing strictly with a cost issue, you might not be able to bring on geothermal, but you might want to have a set aside for geothermal. So that's my response.
Thank you. And thank you both. I mean, I know that there's a lot. Go ahead, Michael.
Michael?
Oh, I just wanted to point out that even then, in John's answer, it shows what a slippery slope you're faced with if you want to favor certain technologies, which is probably one of the reasons SENER has been very resistant to it, at least in the outset of the market. I suppose I can foresee if the market fails to produce any significant renewable generation, there will be this may be revisited. But right now, when the market hasn't even started yet, and when the first cell auction hasn't happened yet, my sense is right now that SENER is going to stick to their guns against kind of set aside.
Yeah, there's been a few instances about the allocate about choosing winners, technology winners. I know it's definitely like you said, a slippery slope. In terms of, I want to wrap up with a question for both of you to just take a little take a thought and share us your insights. The question is specifically, what are the biggest opportunities for U.S. generators, wholesalers with the New Mexican market? Do you think we'll see more electric interconnections or generation plants connecting directly to the Mexican market? So think about that, but I also want, as sort of a final comment from each of you, just in a sentence or two, what does the new wholesale electric market, what is the single biggest opportunity that is presented? But then at the same time, where do we really need to focus, and where does the government really need to focus in the next 9 months that they really are able to unveil the market and everything function, and like you said, John, deliver the lower prices that is the political promise? So, John, why don't you take your final thoughts, and then we'll have Michael, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I think the biggest opportunities for U.S. generators wholesale, frankly, is in gas-fired. There's been a huge initiative to bring more natural gas from the U.S. across the border from Texas. Pemex has a big pipeline going into the Bajío, the San Ramones 2 project, and then CFE has a whole lot of pipelines being built onto the west side of the country. And so gas-fired is just critical to meet these lower price objectives. So my work today has been very heavily in renewables, but frankly, I see bigger opportunities in gas-fired right now, because as you go into a market, it's going to be cost-based, and gas is very cheap.
It's a good way to move from about 20% reliance on fuel oil in Mexico, that's for sure. Michael, do you have any thoughts? And especially, John skipped the big. What's the big challenge? What's the big thing that we should look around the corner on the next 9 months?
Well, I think the big challenge is going to be, there are going to be two challenges. One is this market going to work from day one? And as I said, one of the things that I like about the market is the fact that it's phased, so that there will be some sort of functioning market for wholesale electricity and capacity from the word go, even if it doesn't have all the bells and whistles. But if it turns out that it's a market that can be easily gamed, or if it's not if there's any impairment to reliability or any spike in cost, such as we saw in some other markets in the U.S., then this will be a disaster, because people will not have confidence to invest in the market. So that's one challenge. And the other challenge is both in terms of gas infrastructure and electric transmission infrastructure, whether there'll be the necessary build-out. Right now, the electric transmission infrastructure is very, very weak. Particularly, it's very reliable to deliver electricity to load centers. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but it's very, very weak to deliver remote renewables to load centers. And unless the FTR market really works to incentivize the building of new transmission, we're not going to see a whole lot of anything other than distributed generation or gas-fired generation.
One final comment on challenges. I do see challenges in the clean energy market because of questions about how the CELs are going to work. My sense is that renewable development is stalled right now. You can't build renewable projects without PPAs, and pricing questions are up in the air. And with this heavy emphasis on gas and reduction in prices, there are questions on renewables. I don't see a whole lot of activity out there right now. And it's going to come down to how the CEL market works and whether the auctions do set a baseline and whether people are prepared to enter into long-term bilateral contracts. So there's a challenge.
It's a good point. I mean, in fact, it's going to be one of the things. And I'll jump in and let me thank you both, John McNeese and Michael Hindes. Thank you so much for Pillsbury's participation. And the idea, once the bases were published and set forth and the commentary period began, John, we've been talking about doing something, and so I really appreciate you all jumping on this and sharing your insight. This has been very, very insightful, and there's so many comments and questions I can't even read them all, so I want to also apologize to folks who took the time to write a question that I was not able to get to. And I also want to just plug our event on April 9th in Mexico City, which will continue to have some of these discussions and where renewables fits in. And like John said, the bankability element, I think, is going to be a centerpiece of that discussion, as well as some of the market and regulatory changes in the market guidelines and such. If you want to join us down in Buenos Aires tomorrow, don't hesitate to jump on a plane, or if you're around town, come on over. And then also coming back to our webinar series, we've got a couple already on tap, lined up. March 26th, we're going to talk about Brazil's power sector, which is a whole nother ball of wax. We've got the AES speaker, Francisco Morandi from AES in Brazil. Obviously, there's a drought. There's all kinds of situations or challenges facing the Brazilian market. That'll be exciting. BP's annual energy outlook, the North America piece of that, will have speaker from BP sharing that report and their outlook on April 14th. La Jolla Energy Conference, May 21st, our annual flagship event. Come join us. And then just finally, June 23rd in Santiago, Chile, where, as John mentioned, there has been a lot of, continues to be a lot of updates on the Chilean electric market, and it's something that the Bachelet government continues to work on in their second year. Thank you all so much. Appreciate your time. Sorry to drag this out over the time, the cutoff time, but I think the discussion was hard to stop because it was so fruitful. So thank you, John, and all your partners, and Michael, and we'll see everyone online or in person soon. And Alexis, thank you so much for all the work on the backside to make this just keep running. It's been smooth. I know some of the volume people had some comments, but Alexis is dialing in as much as she can. So thank you all again. Appreciate your time, and we'll catch you online or in person very soon.